Hello everyone and welcome back to the Great Book of Grudges. My name is Nathan and we're back with another Total War Warhammer video. Today we're going to continue our series regarding the base race factions and their faction leaders, which are in dire need of a rework, or at least in my opinion anyway, with today's character being Malekith himself. So without further ado, let's begin. Malekith is the king of Nagaroth, Lord of the Druki, and the one true Phoenix King by birthright, as he is the son of a Narian. That last statement is debatable depending on who you may ask, but there is no question that Malekith is extremely important in the Warhammer Fantasy Battles universe. His inclusion as a base race legendary lord for the Dark Elves in Total War Warhammer 2 was naturally expected, and plays rather well in all honesty. However, as DLCs have been introduced to Total War Warhammer 2, the base game legendary lords have fallen short, as the DLC lords themselves usually receive a bunch of new mechanics specifically to them. Malekith unfortunately also suffers from this, where those who would normally be considered his lessers in lore are more entertaining in all honesty. Where it could easily be said that Malekith's faction plays like a generic faction that doesn't have a legendary lord, there is really not much difference there. And it is a shame, considering that Malekith himself is not only the faction leader but also the racial leader. The one thing that let him stand out was the fact that he had a dragon mount, and that was lost as soon as Lokia was implemented, as he also had a dragon too. Malekith's own faction effects aren't really that terrible. He gives a percentage of experience earned to other lords. He has negative diplomatic relations to the faction of Exiles of Nehek. He has positive faction relations with the Cult of Pleasure, obviously Mummy Dearest, increased loyalty for newly recruited lords, and finally an increased chance of loyalty loss for lords of a higher rank than Malekith. The faction effects work rather well, but there is an issue here. Those effects themselves are pretty generic, and they don't let Malekith stand out from the other Dark Elf factions, so what could be added in to make him feel more unique? Well, before that, I do have to state that I'm fully aware that Malekith is a base race faction, meaning that this is a faction that players normally pick up first in an effort to learn the race as a whole, but he is the king and he deserves a bit more. Of course, also these ideas are those that I've come up with myself or spoken about with other members of the community, but I think they would work for Malekith's faction, so let's just jump right in. Firstly, a rework of diplomatic relations. The negatives against the Exiles of Nehek makes no sense. It's a faction which generally doesn't last that long, and it just feels like you're just going to get declared war on with something that shouldn't really bother you too much. Especially since you're dealing with a lot of other factions like the Skaven or the Norskans, which might present a bit more of an issue. If anything, the minor diplomatic relations should be focused on the High Elves and the Wood Elves. It just makes more sense, as obviously the High Elves are Malekith's main enemy in the lore, those who don't want to bow down to his rule, and obviously the Wood Elves would be counted among them. Isolationist as they may be, it's very likely that Malekith would turn his attention to the Wood Elves after taking over Ulthuan. This is obviously ignoring the end times, of course. Next would be how Malekith himself would deal with the other Dark Elf factions. You see, the Dark Elves themselves have a very weird hierarchy. Many of them do fight under Malekith's name. However, there are certain other factions within the race which try to act in their own accord. Many of these Dark Elf factions try to be as independent as possible. Obviously, Malekith himself would want no insubordinates. At the end of the day, as far as he's concerned at the very least, he is the one true Phoenix King, and these are his subjects. There is a governmental system which Malekith rules over, known as the Black Council, where many different dreadlords and other different types of lords will rule over certain bodies of the Dark Elves. And a Black Council mechanic is very easily fought up with already implemented stuff in the game. Say for example, all the main holds of the Dark Elf territories would fall under a similar mechanic to that of the Empire's Electoral Council. However, with a few changes. Firstly, the members of the Black Council are free to declare war against each other. There's nothing stopping them, as Dark Elf unity was never really a thing. And you won't get the usual events that the Empire have. For example, should a random event pop up where a Beastmen army is attacking one of the Dark Elf holds. It's none of your concern if their weakness is showing and they can't defend themselves. The influence mechanic would be more or less the same, however it would make more sense if it was renamed to Dread. Now you're probably wondering, what's the point of having the electoral mechanic if everything has been stripped down so bare? Well, the framework would stay rather the same, where you would have a bunch of different locations highlighted in this map, each being held by their own respective lord. As with the Empire mechanic, you would be able to take over these territories, and by taking the regional province, you would then be able to instate one of your chosen dreadlords as the leader of this region. By doing so, you would then unlock a special regimental renown only available to that region, and possibly get a bonus or two. However, I would see it rather differently here too, where for example, if you took the regional capital but didn't take the minor settlements, you could then either force the faction to confederate with you, which would work rather well for other legendary lords, or if they're a minor faction and you don't want the territory just yet, you can force them to be your vassal. This is when the dread mechanic comes into effect. You'll have to spend a certain amount of dread per turn on the faction which is your vassal, or else they will rebel against you. Something like that would make sense. Everything is a little bit turbulent when it comes to the Dark Elves, and if they don't fear you, it's very likely they'll start working against you. Naturally, this Black Council mechanic would work for practically every Dark Elf legendary lord, though it would be important to note that Lokia would have no bonuses from this unless he starts taking territories up north, and Malice Darkblade would probably want to take the city that rightfully belongs to him. So this mechanic at least could benefit everyone. It's not exactly a carbon copy of the electoral mechanic, but rather using its framework and expanding upon it. And finally, the last idea, which I think many people kinda expected for me to cover, the fact that Malekith needs to have a reason to invade Orphan. Malekith claims to be the one true Phoenix King, however in your campaigns there's really not much of a reason to go there other than taking advantage of the many port cities to increase your income. Many Dark Elf players will indeed invade Orphan, but what if there was a thematic approach to it? I'm talking about the possibility of Malekith becoming Phoenix King. I envision an event such as that in the following way. Malekith would have to launch a number of invasions of Orphan, in a very similar sense to those armies that you can spawn in the Vortex campaign. You would have to buy 3 separate armies, the first one being relatively cheap, the second being more expensive, and the third being ridiculously expensive. This would spawn a number of armies, possibly 2 to 3, around Orphan itself, and it would be a NPC playable faction, known as the Witch King's Legions. These armies would vary, with the cheaper ones being more focused around baseline units, and the more expensive ones being more focused around the elite. When you have summoned the third and final strike force is when you can finally try and become Phoenix King. For that, it would be an event trigger, very similar to how the Vortex campaign works, where you will need to control a few different points of Orphan, and survive for a certain number of turns. As you're doing so, armies of High Elves will spawn to varying degrees. The first few armies will be relatively weak, and they'll get stronger and stronger. You'd have to survive for 20 turns or so, which could be increased depending on your difficulty. So say if you're playing in Legendary mode, it could be 45 turns instead, with more and more High Elf armies spawning. But if you manage to defend all the points and fight off the elves, then you'll be crowned Phoenix King, where you've basically broken the will of the remaining High Elves. From there, the High Elves would be forced to recognize you as the one true Phoenix King, where maybe minor factions, not the ones including legendary lords, would be forced to become your vassal. These would only be the High Elf factions available in Orphan from the start. but given the fact that they would most likely band against you when you trigger this event, they might not even be alive. I know this event sounds like a bit much, but then again there's no true endgame for the Darkos, especially since the Chaos Invasion is, well, rather lackluster. So an endgame event which is only specific to one character, that being Malekith becoming Phoenix King, might be rather interesting. I think the first few discussed mechanics seem more likely, but something like this, an endgame, a proper endgame for each faction, might be interesting. Because no matter how many Chaos sub-factions get implemented, they'll never really be a true threat. But what do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and let's start a bit of discussion. And let me know your ideas as to how Malekith could just be made a tad more fun. But with that, my friends, we've come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, might I suggest giving the video a like or even subscribing to the channel, as it really does help us out. In the description section below are various links to different social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and Discord. Also in the description section is an affiliate link with Element Games where you could buy loads of hobby-based products, not just Warhammer, for 10 to 25% off. Making a purchase using that link and also our special code, which is also in the description, supports the channel at no extra cost to you, which we think is rather cool. A big thank you to our patrons. Your support means the world to us. It's amazing that people want to help a small channel like us grow and get to a higher level of content. A big thank you to Gibraltar LUSC, Ryan Bertsche, Andrew Prince and Okro for subscribing to us at our fame level. You guys are super cool. And a big thank you to Edward Yule, VS Vasan, Aaron Whitman and Shaggy for subscribing to us at our king level. Honestly, we can't thank you all enough. And lastly, a big thank you to all of you for liking, sharing and commenting on these videos. Honestly, it's because of you guys that the channel's been growing at such a great pace lately, so we can't thank you all enough. But with that, my friends, thank you so much for watching once again, and we shall see you all again very, very soon. Have a good day.